Hey, welcome in. So this is actually going to be an overview presentation of our group project. Now, this is the summer 2021 semester at Valencia College, and this is the IT project management course that we're taking with Professor Tim Starr. Our project is called You Either Know It or You Don't. A little bit of a play on words here because it, when spelled out, can be thought of as like IT, and that's kind of the whole subject matter here. We have 16 members. We have Ariel, Aureliano, Brandon, Eric, Richard, and Noah. Now, just to start off with our presentation here, I want to show you a quick overview of what we actually made. And so the website here is essentially the first letter of all of our first names rearranged. And it looks like this. So when you actually load the website, it's pretty bare minimum. The intention here was originally to be a trivia game, but it more or less turned out into a quiz, but that's okay. The way that it works right now is that you read the questions, you select a couple of answers, so you select basically one answer per question. So you select, say like, a couple of these. I don't know, I'm just guessing. And then once you get through the whole quiz, then you click the submit button, and the web page will tell you your score. And that's pretty much what we have. It's a static web page, it doesn't refresh or anything. It's pretty simple. Now, the goal for this presentation is there's a couple of things we have to go over. So the first thing is we want to go over the stages of the project, so kind of the trajectory of what path we took in order to complete the project. So there's 4 stages to that process. I also want to highlight some of the specific things that each of our team members did, what their roles were, and pretty much their contributions. Then I want to go over more or less the concepts that I believe we learned related to project management in this course and in this project. Those will be definitely only a tip of the iceberg. So, just take all of this with a grain of salt that, this is a very basic overview of everything. And the last thing I want to give is some advice. So if you're starting a project or maybe you're teaching a project management course or something, what things can you do and what things can you learn about in order to better succeed at that project? So I guess we'll just start here. So the stages of the project, there's 4 stages. The first stage is the initiating phase. Second stage is the planning phase. Third stage is the execution phase. And the fourth phase is the closing phase. So you can think of this as like the start, the planning of the project, the doing the project, and the end of the project. So I'll actually start off here at the initiating phase. In this phase, pretty much since we were starting it, we didn't really have a good grasp of what we were doing. So that was sort of the first decision here was, what exactly are we doing? Kind of like which direction are we going to go in? Are we going to build a physical thing, or are we going to do like a software project? Where is our interest essentially? And so before we could actually jump into that, we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to talk to each other? How are we going to share any files or discoveries with each other? And then where are we going to have meetings? And in fact, these 3 things here, the communication, the meetings, and the files, we actually did all of those in Google. So there's a Google app for each of these. So in particular, for the communication, we focused on Google Hangouts. And so this is an app in Google. So if you look at your Google apps, the Google Hangouts is right here, and pretty much it's a group chat. You can submit links, you can show pictures, you can put GIFs in here, pretty much anything that you can do in a very flexible group chat or a messaging app, you can do in here. And in fact, a really cool thing about Google Hangouts is that you can also link to Google Meetings. So you can just click on this button right here, share with all your team members a Meet video link. Press that, and usually it will autocomplete here essentially giving you this sort of format where, it gives you a link and then you click on it and it'll open a Google Meeting. So this is where we communicated, and the Google Meets, since it's built into it, that's actually where we did our meetings. And as for the file sharing, we actually use Google Drive. So in this case, I just built a pretty simple drive. This has all of our files in it. So we have like, all of our website files, all of our code, and just all of the planning templates that we made, as well as the meetings. So I actually kept some track of what meetings we attended and when. But yeah, this is pretty much the initiating phase. It was just getting a very basic understanding of the project, how are we going to communicate, and things like that. We also met with our professor to give him an overview, but that was more or less just like a, hey man, just check out our work and see what we're doing. Okay, second phase is the planning phase. This was probably the most important thing. So as a part of this whole process, so it's pretty much just paperwork. There's 5 different things we had to complete, but each of them satisfying a very specific purpose for our understanding. And so in this case, all 5 of these documents, since they are on Google Drive, I just want to show you real quick what they are and what they do. So the project charter is basically just a project overview. Very, very simply, what are we doing? How are we going to know that we did it? And what is like the approach to getting that done? This also sort of outlines the different roles that each of us are going to be doing and who is doing what. So who has what role and how do you contact them? Now, of course, I took that out just for confidentiality, but you get the idea. Project charter, very simple overview. And then another part of the planning phase, another document was the expectations document. So this thing kind of lists out, okay, what are the different things we're trying to achieve, and how do we like what are we expecting um, from that? Like how are we going to hit those targets? And so this sort of breaks down, what are we expecting of each of these particular, they're called measures, but what are we expecting from them? And then how do we ensure that we actually hit those expectations? Now, the third document, very simply, is just a list of risks. So, what could go wrong, basically. This is not in depth at all for us because there really wasn't much to worry about. Since we were building a website with a game on it, there really wasn't much that could go wrong. But, we did try to actually specify some things here. So, for example, the number one risk is not finishing on time. That would have been pretty bad. But, there are other things here that are a little bit more specific to doing an actual software project. And then the fourth thing that we worked on in the planning phase, this is actually the most important thing that we could have worked on. So this actually breaks down all the phases. So you can see here, initiating phase, planning phase, executing phase. So this is sort of the breakdown of all the different phases and all the different tasks that we're going to have to do for each of the phases. So you might actually notice that in the presentation, all the different bullet points on each phase is going to line up with the WBS here, the work breakdown structure. And that's by design. This thing is supposed to pretty much tell you exactly what you're doing. Now, one step beyond that, and in fact the last thing that we worked on, the Gantt chart, is pretty much a carbon copy of your WBS. So it takes each of these tasks and it breaks down, okay, when are they going to occur? Like when are we going to do them? And then who is going to work on them? So this document here, it takes each of those bullet points and it pretty much gives you an x-axis. This is a time axis. And in each of these boxes, you're pretty much going to specify, who does it. And since it's also lined up with dates, you'll also know, okay, when exactly it's happening. So for instance, like this portion here indicates that, someone's going to be designing the website. And the pink is going to indicate a team member. So the team member here is Aureliano. And the goal for him is to design the website between June 17th and June 21st. And so this is pretty much a specific task breakdown for each of our team members and when they're going to do those tasks. And so I should note that each of these things in the planning phase is extremely important and you cannot skip on them. If you skip on them, then you're not going to have a good understanding of what you're doing. And so, that's kind of what we did for our project. Now for the actual doing of the project, the execution phase, we pretty much had three things that we had to do. The fourth thing is just making it public. But the first thing was to actually build the website, and sort of get like a very simple, local run of a website. So in particular, you know, this local run is not going to be run on an actual web server, but it's just going to be run off of your local computer. So that was the first goal here, was to get that done to actually build the website. The second thing that we did was we actually figured out, okay, what kinds of questions are we going to actually put in this sort of trivia game? And so once we had a good understanding of what questions we're doing and what the website is going to look like, then basically we integrated all of that into the website. So we integrated the questions and the answers into the website, and we never really got to making it a game, but that's pretty much what we did, is we tried to integrate all the questions into the website and make it sort of, at least somewhat interactive to where it actually checks your answers. And then the last step of the execution phase for us was taking our essentially quote unquote finished product, but realistically it was a rough draft, and publishing this to the public in the form of the website that I listed before. Now, once we actually had this, we did have to make a decision. Okay, are we going to continue further and make it more complicated? Are we going to add more features to it and stuff? But just in the interest of time, since we actually hit a lot of technical difficulties with this project, related to like, the project not working and having to troubleshoot exactly, what's going wrong, and we had to pretty much debug our entire game for like a month, to figure out like, okay, why is the submit button not working and stuff. So with that being said, it took us quite a while to actually get the rough draft of the project to the forefront. And so we had to make a decision, okay, are we gonna go further than this or are we not? And unfortunately, just in the interest of time, we had to pretty much close out the project. And so in the closing phase of the project, it's pretty simple. We had to wrap up the website. We had to essentially finalize what it was going to look like, and upload it and publish it to the public. Um, then, just as a good measure, we showed our professor the project to show him, what we've done and sort of what our progress looks like. And then the last two parts here are essentially just write-ups on what we did. So the final project report, we finished this. Um, it was essentially, there was a group project portion of it where, it sort of entails like an overview of the project. And then there's an individual component to this report where each individual person sort of talks about, what they did, what they learned, and so on and so forth, and in their own advice, essentially. And so you're going to see a lot of parallels between the report and the presentation right here. In fact, this presentation is sort of derived from the report because there's really no way around it. There isn't anything else in the report that I would present on. And so that's kind of the last thing here in the closing phase, was actually getting the report done and then deriving a presentation based off of it. Now, as promised, I do want to go over a little bit of what each person did. So first of all, Brandon, he was our website dev. He actually researched and figured out how to not only code the website but also publish it. So in this case, he was the one responsible for getting the website to work and getting it to essentially be able to be opened in any web browser. He had to rent out a domain name, and then he had to host it on an actual website. Well, it's not like a website per se, but it's, like a web hosting site essentially. And then Richard, he was the quote unquote question maker. He actually did all the research and wrote all the questions for the project itself. He had a lot more questions than we ended up putting in, but we decided, just for the sake of simplicity, we wanted to keep the questions kind of small because we needed, more or less a rough draft and not a final quote unquote trivia game. Ariel, she pretty much did the whole game. So she researched and coded the game. She was the one to start the actual bulk of the project. She originally wanted to do it in Python, but we had to actually end up doing it in JavaScript since the website was built in HTML. And Unfortunately, JavaScript just works a little bit better with HTML than Python does. And so she had to adapt quite a bit for that. She had to research and kind of figure out, how do you actually code in JavaScript. And with that came a lot of trouble, of course, a lot of troubleshooting, a lot of debugging. Um, I did come in and help her out with a lot of this. So for about 2 or 3 weeks, we had to troubleshoot what was going wrong, and so my role as a project manager was not just organizing and facilitating team communication, but also in this particular case, I did contribute quite a bit to the coding of the game. So I had to debug a bunch of stuff, and that was pretty fun. Now, the last two members to note here are Aureliano and Noah. They were sort of more general roles that didn't really get a lot of love in this project, since we never got out of that rough draft phase. Their roles of sort of reinventing the project never got to see a lot of practice, but essentially Aureliano, he provided like design guidelines for the questions. So he gave Richard some idea of like, do we want, fill in the blank questions? Do we want multiple choice or, true false or free response, all that sort of stuff. Just to keep it kind of simple. We basically stuck with just multiple choice and true false, but um, he did provide some guidelines for us. And he would have provided more if we had more time, especially if it turned into a game. And then the last person to mention here is Noah. He was our dedicated tester and quality assurance person. So basically, if we ever had to test, the code and the website, he would have been responsible for this testing. Now, again, since we didn't really get out of a rough draft phase, there really wasn't much for him to do in this regard, because it never got complicated. We kept it pretty simple. But he did give some suggestions about how we would have tested the product if it did happen to get out of this rough draft phase. So he did provide for us a little bit of a framework there. And now, besides the contributions and the specifics of the project, some more general things that we learned about project management. I think the most important thing we learned was team communication. Really, that was where we shined, I think. If we didn't communicate properly, I don't think we would have completed this project with the amount of time that we had, pretty much. I learned how to, organize and manage, meetings and stuff, but also just like, how do you manage like individual needs? So some individuals will not really need to be in a group meeting per se. They would more prefer talking, one-on-one with the project manager. And so, sort of understanding like each person's proclivities for communication is really key in this project, I thought. And so I really learned a lot about that, but I think everyone else did as well. Now, as for specifics of project management, the essentially the syllabus listed a bunch of specific things, but just to break down more simply what we learned with project management, we definitely learned quite a bit about project scope. So our project didn't really have that big of a scope, but the good thing is that we actually had to limit our scope from the start. So even before we started the project, I insisted, and everyone else did too, to keep the project as simple as possible. Just in case, if we do hit into technical difficulties, that we won't have to like feel bad about it. And so that's kind of what happened. And so I'm very happy that we tried to discipline ourselves and keep the project from getting too crazy, essentially. We don't want to give ourselves too many requirements for a software project where not everyone is a developer. So we definitely learned a lot about project scope. Now, as for other things like time management, cost management and quality management, those things, I think we learned more or less about those from the documents that we made. I wouldn't say we learned a lot about that from the project itself. However, as far as like recognition is concerned, I think we do have a pretty good understanding of what each of those sort of management concepts looks like. And then the last thing here is the project roles that are needed. So not everybody was comfortable with the technical role. Obviously, not everyone is a programmer or a website developer. So we had to sort of come up with different roles for people to actually contribute to the project without needing that sort of intricate IT experience. And so I think that we had a lot to learn about, taking on roles that maybe we're not comfortable with, and trying to do the best that we can with those roles. And then lastly, really the thing that, you might have stuck around for is like the advice. What are you going to be able to do in order to better succeed with project management? Well, pretty much in this case, the planning phase was the key to the whole project. I would say if we didn't spend as much time on the planning phase, I think we would have really struggled to have a good understanding of what we're even doing. And so never, ever, ever try to rush through the planning phase. You should always treat it with a lot of respect, and you should also try to be very, very careful. You don't want to overthink something, but you also don't want to underthink something. You need to treat it with a lot of care and really dig your feet in and try to figure out exactly what you're doing and when you're doing it, in fact. Then the second thing here, as far as advice goes, is try to work well with others, even if you don't agree with them. Try to find ways of talking to somebody, even though you may not like what they're saying, just so that you can all sort of work together to get the project done, because at the end of the day, like we're trying to get a project done. We don't really care too much about individual egos and things of that sort. So definitely try to keep your ego down. Try to focus on the completion of the project, even if you don't like how it's happening and who's leading. So you definitely have to be good at that. And then as far as flexibility and adaptation, it pretty much just comes down to the fact that we're a small team. The smaller the team, the more roles each person has to take on. And so definitely be open to taking on more roles than you might be expecting. And also be understanding if you are assigned a role that you may not be comfortable with. That's another thing that's very important to note. And the last thing here that I noted is to be on time and be dependable. This thing is make or break with a big project like in the real world or even a small project in our case. Definitely communicate with others, as mentioned before. But more importantly than communication, definitely be on time and try never to show up late and make up for it after. You have to be dependable and we have to know that you're consistent. If you're all those things that I mentioned here, then you should pretty much do well regardless of the project. Um, and that's pretty much everything. That's what our project was, that's what we learned, and that's what you should do if you want to be successful as well. I actually enjoyed this project quite a bit. In fact, I'm taking on new project roles where I'm interning, but pretty much this is the first step I thought in, a project management future. So I'm really happy that I was able to take part in this project, and I was really happy that we were able to actually finish to some regard, right? Like even if it wasn't perfect, we at least got something that was in a working state. And so I'm kind of excited for what future projects we're gonna be, looking at in our careers. And so, that's pretty much everything. And yeah, that's all. So if you learned something, that's awesome. And even if you didn't, and it just confirmed what you already know, then hopefully this was in line with that. But you know, that's everything. So yeah, thank you.